Hello, and thank you for joining me for my virtual presentation exploring regional representation in the House of Lords through territorial designations of peerages. I'm Rob Swetlick. I'm an incoming PhD student based in Detroit, Michigan, and this presentation has been prepared for the Political Studies Association's conference titled Politics Today. So, despite many successive governments expressing interest in enacting wholesale reform of the House of Lords, only incremental alteration has been successfully implemented. Yet, the Chamber's future is still in question as scholars and policymakers debate the need for election and the question of whether or not territorial representation needs to be enshrined in the Chamber. However, such debates often overlook the historical link between peerages and place and fail to consider how these links could be modernized to create a contemporary form of territorial representation. Peerages and the nature of peerage is inherently territorial. This paper is complemented by an interactive map of the UK, which visualizes the distribution of peers across the four nations. Additionally, the flexibility of the Westminster system to incorporate reform without primary legislation indicates that novel solutions to address ideological challenges without that primary legislation may be the most practical way to incrementally improve the chamber. The historical significance of peerages and the evolution of the nobility is well documented, specifically by historian Michael McCahill, who authored The Changing Character of British Nobility for the English Historical Review in the 1980s. McCahill identifies that peerages were historically given to the realm's great landlords, and territorial designations indicated landholdings on behalf of the recipient. This began to change, of course, in the 19th century. The character of the British nobility, McCahill writes, significantly changed in 1801 when landless peers began to proliferate in mass, and instead of the exception, they became the norm in the upper chamber. And so territorial designations have been relegated to a symbolic significance ever since. The main feature of this project has been visualizing the distribution of territorial designations of peers across the United Kingdom. The method was an ArcGIS interactive map.
This identifies the localities associated with all 800 plus sitting and non-sitting peers.
The data was sourced from the Register of Members' Interests, the London Gazette, ArcGIS, and Esri. That was not only how territorial designations were identified, but then also how they were pinpointed on the map geographically. I'll briefly show you the map. As you can see, this map is a fully interactive, clickable, and scalable map. All of the green pins indicate a peer's first territorial designations. Some peers have two. And over here on the side, you can toggle these various feature layers so that you can get a sense of where your peer is located. Zooming into the map, you can click on each of the pins to learn more about your peer and find their parliamentary career. For example, this is Baroness Armstrong of Hilltop. She is designated in Crook in County Durham. Using this feature layer, we can see she falls into the ceremonial county of Durham. She falls into the historic county of Durham. This feature layer allows you to see where your peer falls within your local government district. You can also toggle the regions of England, so we see she's in the Northeast. And additionally, she's in the Northeast Combined Authority. So the feature layers really help you get a sense of how a peer may have only one territorial designation, but they can fall into several different localities and geographies. The process of importing the Lord Spiritual and Lord Temporal into ArcGIS revealed many insights about the personal and political associations between a peer and their nomen localis. It also provided data for analysis about the representation of the four nations. All English, Welsh, and Northern Irish ceremonial and historic counties claim at least one sitting Lord Temporal whose first territorial designation falls within the nation. Again, a first territorial designation refers to some peers who have their peerages designated in two places. For example, Chilton in the county of Oxfordshire and Camden Town in the London borough of Camden. All first territorial designations were what was considered for purposes of this paper, though all secondary territorial designations were recorded with green crosses on the interactive map. Scotland's counties fared the poorest, with 10 ceremonial and 12 historic counties not claiming at least one sitting peer. However, that is only the story if you measure land alone. Measuring the amount of peers against UK population share shows Scotland is actually slightly overrepresented in the House of Lords. So Scotland has 73 peers
or 9.6% of all sitting lords temporal,
against an 8.1% UK population share, while Wales has 39 peers, or 3.6% of sitting peers, against a 5.1% UK population share, and Northern Ireland has 20 peers,
or 2.6% of sitting lords temporal.
against a 2.8% UK population share. Speaking again about those peers who find themselves designated in two places, for example, Baron Rowlands is designated in two localities, both in Wales, relatively close together. And then you have a few peers who have a territorial designation outside of the United Kingdom. For example, Baroness Lawrence of Clarendon, her primary territorial designation is found in Jamaica. The ability of peers to have multiple nomen locali in their letters patent and associated with their titles also produced many peers with both first and secondary territorial designations outside of the United Kingdom. That includes localities in Egypt, India, Ireland, Jamaica, New Zealand, Nigeria, Russia, and Uganda. Examining peers' territorial designations revealed many symbolic and personal connections to place. Peers often have a residence in the place where they are designated, or perhaps they lived in a place before. There are also many former MPs who select their prior constituencies as their territorial designation when they make the transition from the House of Commons to the House of Lords. Peers collaborate with the Garter King of Arms to select their titles, and many have a deep interest in the historical context of their locality, and they work with the Garter King of Arms to research the place before naming it in their letters patent. There seems to be an enduring cultural significance, and this was outlined by previous scholars, that while peerages no longer maintain a statutory connection to their territorial designation, there remains a cultural significance and a personal significance for many peers when selecting their place. Such is the strength of many peers' connection to their territorial designation that it stands to reason establishing a formal duty for them to represent their localities would enable a form of ad hoc territorial representation in the upper chamber without primary legislation or the upheaval of the established political system. And a prime example of the appointive model coexisting alongside territorial representation comes from Canada. The Canadian Parliament, of course, draws heavy inspiration from Westminster, retaining the Prime Minister's ability to appoint senators to the upper chamber at his discretion. However, there are some key differences. Canadian senators are obligated to live in and represent in the upper chamber the territory for which they are designated to represent. For the purposes of Senate representation, there are several districts. These districts serve as the divisions for the purposes of senatorial appointments. Similar to the House of Lords, the appointive model has cultivated a Canadian Senate that maintains a majority independent caucus. This caucus is free from electioneering and the political party influence that is so often exercised in the Houses of Commons. But most notably, the Canadian system exploits the appointive model to ensure its upper chamber has a direct mandate to elevate regional and minority interests in their parliament. While most functions of the Canadian Senate are explicitly written in the Constitution Acts, the flexible nature of the British Westminster system would allow for a limited implementation of Canadian-inspired reforms without the need for primary legislation. The ability for a prime minister and potentially for the House of Lords Appointments Commission to enact changes to the appointments process has been well documented by constitutional scholars, namely Meg Russell at the University College London. Additionally, some territorial stipulations are already applied to prospective candidates by the House of Lords Appointments Commission. For example, candidates are required to be domiciled in the United Kingdom and maintain that residence for the duration of their appointment in the House of Lords. This function could be expanded through political consensus and a commitment from the Prime Minister to consider the geography of new appointments. This specifically could apply to party political peers, which are only subject to propriety checks by the House of Lords Appointments Commission. All other criteria is determined by the parties themselves. And so it would be within the opposition leaders and the Prime Minister's power to consider geography and territorial distribution of potential candidates when making new recommendations for the Lords. Of course, any reforms to the House of Lords do not come without significant challenges. Dissimilar to the Canadian Senate, the high level of variance in the systems that geographically divide and govern the United Kingdom do not provide any obvious constituencies for the House of Lords. Specifically, there are major challenges to defining the constituencies for English peers due to the asymmetrical pattern of devolution in England. The English regions are one way the House of Lords Library tracks peers across England. However, since the cessation of European Parliament elections, these areas are largely statistical and don't hold much function in local governance. They're also very large, so it gives a less granular view of territorial representation. The historic and ceremonial counties are more granular than the English regions, but they vary in population size. So it raises questions of malapportionment, of smaller, less populated counties having an outsized influence in the House of Lords through an excess number of representatives. Beyond the substantial challenge of identifying constituencies, the Prime Minister and House of Lords Appointments Commission have no real method to compel peers to select a territorial designation corresponding with their residence. The process of selecting a locality in letters patent is decided entirely privately between a peer and the Garter King of Arms. And while the Prime Minister and the House of Lords Appointments Commission could consider where they live and their residence, there is currently no way to compel them to select their residence for their territorial designation. Additionally, these reforms are in part predicated on the Prime Minister acting in good faith by considering territorial distribution when selecting his peerages and by asking the opposition leaders and the House of Lords Appointments Commission to do the same, even when this may conflict with their personal or political goals. The theme of this conference was Politics Today, and it asked early career researchers to explore novel solutions to Britain's current and future challenges. And I think in this paper, the goal was exploring novel ways to create territorial representation through historic links without major upheaval or primary legislation. There is great historical significance for territorial designations, and they set a precedent for renewing the link between peerage and place. The personal and symbolic connections that current peers have with their place is clearly identified. Many peers are already distinguished local champions and champions of friendless causes, and this is part of the appointive model. And this appointive model, modified to incorporate territorial representation, could create a link between peers and the places where they are designated. Many proposals for the House of Lords fixate on wholesale reform and election, but as previously mentioned, there are a lot of irreconcilable views on elections, the necessity of elections, the type of electoral system, and the boundaries of constituencies, and those have historically led to failure and abandonment of those reforms. What has been successful is incremental reform, specifically reform that has avoided primary legislation. Such reforms as the establishment of the House of Lords Appointments Commission itself was done without primary legislation and has been considered very successful in propriety checks and maintaining a significant crossbench faction in the House of Lords. The Canadian Senate serves as a model for solving these ideological challenges of territorial representation without major upheaval of the political system, and gives us a good example of how the prerogative of the Prime Minister is preserved alongside territorial representation in an upper chamber in a Westminster system. While some may consider peers the surviving vestiges of a feudal era, re-examining the past and reclaiming links from the past and modernizing them for a contemporary context could be the primary way to honor the chamber's legacy while also modifying it for the contemporary era. Thank you so much for joining me today and listening. This is my first conference presentation, and I'm an incoming PhD student this fall. So I am very much looking forward to feedback on not just the presentation, but the paper itself and the interactive map, which will all be made available. And thank you to the Political Studies Association for hosting us and this virtual conference.